All right, now that we've explored the idea of rights and how they are explained as another form of deontology related to Kantianism, I'd like to sort of get into specifically John Arthur's use of rights as a counter to what Singer said in his article. Okay, so again, as I said before, right, you want to start with asking ourselves, what is the philosopher arguing, and what theory is the philosopher using to support his or her argument. Okay, so Arthur is arguing that Singer is wrong, that we do not have an obligation to donate to charity. Right? As we've said before, certainly Arthur thinks that giving to charity is morally praiseworthy, is moral extra credit, is supererogatory. It's a good thing, but he doesn't think you're obligated to do it, right, in the way that Singer does. Okay, and so what theory is he using? Right, Arthur, right, doesn't ever mention the name of Kant, right, and that's important because based on what we've talked about, you might not recognize that he was using a deontology, right? But based on what we just talked about with rights, it's important for you guys to understand from this point forward, right, when a philosopher is talking about the idea of rights, that philosopher is using deontology, right? And the concept of rights that the philosopher is using is linked or is grounded in a theory that is Kantian, is like Kant's. It may not exactly be Kant's, but again, their discussion of rights makes sense if you understand those rights in Kantian kind of terms, even if it's not Kant specifically. Okay, so the question really for this part of the lecture is going to be, well, how does Arthur apply the concept of negative and positive rights to argue that Singer is wrong? Okay, so Arthur certainly is arguing that Singer incorrectly assumes that strangers have positive rights to life against other strangers. Right? Arthur says, well, look, what Singer is doing in his article, right, with his argument, is saying, if his argument was true, let's say, okay, then what Singer is showing is that, right, strangers have a positive right to life against other strangers. Right? That if they lack the basic needs of life, food, shelter, clean water, they have positive rights to those things from other people who they don't know, right? And that's why Singer thinks that people who have excess money that we spend on luxury goods are obligated to donate that money to get them, those people who have a lack of food, water, and shelter. That's why we have an obligation to give to them, because those people have a positive right against us, right? And so, one important thing to understand here, right, is that Arthur's argument against Singer is very different than all those objections we talked about, right, that Singer deals with, right? Generally, the objections that Singer dealt with were objections that played right into the hands of consequentialism, right? But what Arthur is doing here is he's saying, well, look, Singer is wrong because he's got the wrong theory, right? Singer is wrong because he's a consequentialist, and what Arthur is saying is the right theory of ethics is this right-based theory, right, that is grounded in deontology rather than consequentialism. Okay, that really is what Arthur is doing here. Right? That's his argument, is that consequentialism is wrong and the right theory of ethics is deontology, and he's just going to apply deontology to the same situation that Singer did and explain that his view is a better view. Okay, so again, and this is kind of review from the last section, but it's worth going over again. Right? Positive rights between strangers, unlike negative rights, cannot be grounded in the categorical imperative. Right? So the obligation not to kill, for Kant, is a perfect duty. Right? We all have an obligation not to kill all the time. Right? So, because of that, right, we can all be said to have that negative right to life. The right not to be killed because everyone else is obligated not to kill us. Right? That's how it works. That makes total sense to a guy like Arthur. Right? Because he's a deontologist. On the other hand, because for Kant, charity is only an imperfect duty, we do not all have a right to be given charity by someone else. right? That's the key, right? Because not everyone is obligated to help all the time, right? I would have no right to be given charity by anyone else because, right, it'd be, for Kant, because charity is only an imperfect duty, it would be morally acceptable if everyone in the world decided to give to charity other than me at some point in their life. Okay? I mean, that's what it comes to, right? And so, to kind of go forward and to kind of continue this line of thought, right? Arthur would argue that employees are entitled to their own incomes, right? And that starving does not entitle the people starving to the income of other people, of the employees, let's say. Right? And so let's see how that would work on a deontological rights-based understanding of ethics. Right? So, right, if we look at the employer-employee relationship, right, for a deontologist like Arthur, that's an intentional relationship, right? The employee creates, the employee gets into an intentional relationship with the employer by, deciding to enter employment, right? And when the employee works, right, the employee gets a positive right to the wages against the employer, right? That's how it works. Because of the intentional relationship and the nature of that intentional relationship, the employee works in a job for a certain amount of time, and then that creates a positive right or an entitlement to the wages, right? That person has earned, the money that person has earned. Okay. Now, again, because strangers, right, people starving in another country, do not have an intentional relationship with us, right, and we do not have an intentional relationship with them, right, the starving person does not have a positive right to life against us. So the fact that the person starving in another country lacks the basic needs of clean water, food, and shelter, right, that person has no relationship with us, right, with us here in the United States. And so because there's a lack of relationship, that person cannot be said to have a positive right to our earnings, right, the income that we earn from our employers. Okay, we have a positive right to it. The starving person does not, right? And so that's Arthur's argument, right? That certainly it would be wrong of us to go to the other country and kill that person, because that would violate the negative right that person has against us. And really that's because it would violate our perfect duty not to kill. But we are not obligated to give the income that we are entitled to from our employers to someone who's starving in another country. Okay. So again, it's a relatively straightforward view if you understand the concept of rights and how it's grounded in Kant's theory. If you don't understand, right, the stuff from the last part of the lecture, the difference between negative and positive rights, where they come from and all that stuff, right, Arthur doesn't talk about that in his article. But, right, you need to understand that in order to understand the argument that Arthur is making, right? And again, I think I said this in the last part of the lecture, but I'll say it again, right? Arthur's not the only one. Many of these deontological theorists that we're going to talk about in the coming weeks, many of them refer to the concept of rights. They won't mention Kant, but you can't understand what they're saying without an understanding of what rights are and where they come from. And again, for us at least, we're going to look back to Kant to understand where those rights come from. Okay, so right now we've got Arthur on the one side saying deontology, right, and we've got Singer on the other side saying consequentialism. In a sense, in their own realms, both views are compelling, right? Singer, right, draws on the intuitive nature of consequentialism, makes a very simple three-step argument that it's hard to argue with, right? If you buy into the idea that consequences matter morally. On the other hand, right, if you buy into the concept of rights, right, Arthur's argument seems correct as well, right? If you prefer the idea of rights and the separation between negative and positive rights, then Arthur's view is going to appeal to you, and it's going to sound more correct. Okay. So again, if that's the case, is there any way past this? Or is there any way past this disagreement about which theory makes the most sense, right? Certainly you could look back to the individual theories, right, and ask yourself, well, which theory did you like better? Did you like Mill's theory, or did you like Kant's theory better? Right? That's certainly one way to go through with it, right? But this is the point where I think it's important to remember the drowning child example, right? Because, right, certainly Arthur's argument from the perspective of positive and negative rights makes sense, right? It's got rational, it's got reasons behind it, and those reasons are compelling, especially if you thought Kant's theory was compelling, right? But one of the ingenious parts about Singer's theory, right, and specifically this example that he came up with, is that if you run through the example on Arthur's argument, if you run through the example in a rights-based deontology theory, what you realize is that on Arthur's theory, the child drowning is not entitled to have his or her life saved by the stranger, right? That child has no relationship with you. He's not, if the child was your child, right, and you were the child's parent or guardian, then you would have an obligation, right? Because that child would have a positive right to life against you as the parent or guardian, okay? But, right, that's not the way the story goes. The story goes that you don't know this child, right? The child is just a stranger, and you're just a stranger walking by, and you have the opportunity to save that child, right, at the expense of sacrificing the shoes, right, that you are entitled to. That child doesn't have a positive right to life against you as the stranger. So on Arthur's theory, right, if you walk by the drowning child because you don't want to ruin your shoes, you haven't actually done anything wrong, right? And the problem with that is that, again, whether Arthur thinks it's wrong or not, most of us recognize that if you walk by that child because you don't want to ruin your shoes, then you are morally terrible, right? That you've made a morally wrong choice, right? Arthur's argument may be convincing on its own, but for most of us, it's not convincing enough to tell us that we should, buy into the idea that the person that walks by the pond to save their shoes is a good person, or at least hasn't done anything wrong, and is totally within the realm of moral acceptability, right? Most of us aren't willing to go that far. And so what this does, right, is it brings us back to a better understanding of just how, again, ingenious Singer's example is. Because, look, Singer knows, right, that we live in a society that generally agrees with Arthur more than him, right, more than Singer, right? That we live in a society where, at the very least, right, the general view is that there is not an obligation to give to charity. That if you give to charity, that's great, that's morally good, but if you don't, that's okay too, right? And what that example of the drowning child shows is that even in a society like ours that doesn't see an obligation to give to charity seriously, or doesn't take that seriously, and we kind of just, again, chalk it up to moral extra credit, right? In this particular example that he's come up with, right, there's a sense in which, right, we are saying that there's an obligation to save that child even though there is no relationship between us and that child. And that what you recognize in that example is that while you may be entitled to your shoes, if you choose your shoes that you're entitled to over the child's life, that still seems like the morally wrong choice, right? And so if even after this discussion, of the relative merits of Singer's theory and Arthur's theory, if you go back to that example and you still believe that the person who walks by and chooses his or her shoes over the child is a bad person, right, then that seems to make you lean a little bit more towards Singer's view, right? Or if you want to capture that idea on Arthur's view, you'd have to say that the child does have a positive right to life against the stranger, right? And at least for a deontologist, that's going to be hard to explain why that's the case, right? So again, that's what's sort of ingenious about Singer's theory, and specifically this example to back up his argument, is that it seems to work even in a society that doesn't think that we have these obligations between strangers. And so, if you still believe that Arthur is right, that the drowning child example is a big problem for Arthur. It is a problem, not necessarily insurmountable, but it's an issue that Arthur's theory would have to explain, right? It's an objection to Arthur that I don't think he does a great job responding to in his article, and he would have to do a much better job if his counter to Singer was ultimately to be more convincing. Okay? Again, if you guys have questions about this or comments, please do check out that discussion board that I posted. For next week, again, the key things that I want you to do as you're reading the articles is to identify what is the argument that the philosopher is making, and secondly, is this philosopher looking at the issue from a more consequentialist or deontological perspective. All right, I'll talk to you guys again next week.